Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. Abraham Blauvelt was a printer in New Brunswick in the late 1700s and early 1800s. In 1795, he printed this little book titled The Power of Religion on the Mind in Retirement, Sickness, and at Death, exemplified in the testimonies and experience of men distinguished by their greatness, learning, or virtue. It's a long title for such a small book, but Blauvelt and his contemporaries operating in New Jersey after the Revolutionary War owe much to an earlier printer. On today's episode, we are going to examine the printing history of New Jersey and learn about the life and controversies of James Parker, who established New Jersey's first permanent print shop. We are going to talk with historian and author Gordon Bond, who has researched Parker's life and published a new book on his findings. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Gordon, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a bit about the early print history of New Jersey, sort of pre-James Parker?
Well, there really wasn't a lot of history in New Jersey, primarily because by that point the British government had realized that printing and the products of the press could be used as propaganda and a tool of dissent.
Okay.
So there was actually a law that said you couldn't have a print shop in New Jersey.
Huh.
At least not, and you couldn't really print anything unless you had the permission of the government. So whenever anyone needed something printed, they would go either to Philadelphia or to New York to get it done. And also the population was rather sparse at that time. We were still very bucolic, so there wasn't a lot of business. It wouldn't have, from a business standpoint, it wouldn't have made sense to have a print shop.
Okay, so even with that sort of regulation, we do know that there was material actually printed in New Jersey at the time. William Bradford and Perth Amboy and the...
Right. Well, what happened was there were certain things that you had to print by law within the bounds of the colony, and money, things of that nature. So printers would be required to physically bring their press and all their type and all their equipment into New Jersey, do the job, and then take it all out again. So it was actually a very cumbersome process. A lot of times they would try to get a little job printing if they could in the area just to make it worth their while.
Okay. So when you mentioned they actually have to bring all of their equipment and set this equipment up, I mean, we're not talking about small presses. I mean, what sort of equipment are we dealing with? A
press, obviously this isn't life-size, but a press like that, I mean, these were, I don't know, maybe 6, 8 feet. You know, at that point they would have been mostly made out of wood, but there were other iron components and so forth. So it was a large, cumbersome, heavy piece of equipment. Then on top of it, you had all the physical, the type, the movable type, which were all made out of lead, and there would be, you know, several hundred pounds worth of that. You'd have to bring paper. Ink, you made your own ink, so all the materials to mix and create your own inks. So there was a lot of stuff that you had to bring in and take out again when you were done.
So when you talk about type, I mean, each of the letters is a particular type that's then set into an iron frame.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they put the ink over the top and then...
Put the paper on it, and really it's, the printing press, it was kind of a variation on presses you would find to make olive oil and things of that nature. It was just a big, large screw with a plate on the bottom, and you'd pull the lever, and it would push the paper down into the type with the ink on it, and that would make the impression. And you did it one sheet at a time. So for every sheet, you had to pull that lever and go through that process.
So how does New Jersey's printing history compare with the larger region from New York and Philadelphia? I mean, how did they influence printing in New Jersey?
Well, again, because we didn't really have any printers here in New Jersey, people, if you wanted something printed, you had to go outside the colony. So you had, New Jersey, of course, was divided between East and West Jersey. So people on the east side would go into New York, people on the west side would go into Philadelphia, just as a matter of convenience.
Okay.
Yeah, there wasn't really enough business here to make it to make it worthwhile.
Okay. So you talked a bit about regulations. Let's talk about that more in depth. What sort of regulations and why were these regulations in place?
I think the government by this point just recognized that this was a tool that could be used by dissenters. It could be used to create propaganda, and the government wanted to make sure that they had control over that. So you couldn't print something, you couldn't set up a press without the government giving you permission to do it. You couldn't print things a lot of times without having permission to do it. In Philadelphia, under the Quakers, William Bradford was the printer in Philadelphia for the Quakers, and I mean he got in a lot of trouble because he didn't have the proper permissions to print things, or they took offense at certain things that were printed or the way things were phrased. So there's a lot more scrutiny of what you were doing.
So Parker is often regarded as the first permanent printer in New Jersey. Where is he born?
He was born in Woodbridge in 1714. The Parker family originated, they immigrated to Barnstable, Massachusetts, and then came down through Staten Island into Woodbridge, Perth Amboy, and into that area.
Okay, so they're actually like many of the other early colonists to central New Jersey. They're coming from the New England states and resettling in central New Jersey, in this case, the early 18th century. Do you know a bit about his parents? I mean, what sort of occupation did his father have?
His father was a cooper. He made barrels. And his name was Samuel Parker. His mother's name was Jana. Jana Inglis was her maiden name. And so there's not a lot of information about her, but she comes across as being a very strong individual. Parker and his siblings, he had 2 sisters and 3 or 4 brothers. They grew up with learning. There's a surviving family Bible where the kids in the back were like copying out Bible passages and so was practicing their handwriting. They had guidelines and everything. So you could tell there was a lot of homeschooling and so forth. She comes across as being more of a Puritan mindset, and I think that influenced Parker's personality later on. His sort of fatalism, his morbid sense, I think, was heavily influenced by that. Don't know as much about his father. His father, he died when Parker was about 12 years old. And he appears to have been stricken, maybe perhaps a stroke or something. His will, his signature is just a scribble.
So at some point, Parker decides he wants to be a printer. There's an apprenticeship that takes place, which was common at that time.
Right.
Tell me a bit about that period of his life.
Well, he didn't necessarily choose to be a printer. Apprenticeship was a way of bringing children up in a trade so that when they were adults, they could, pay their own way. They wouldn't become burdens on the community. You didn't necessarily get to pick what you wanted to do. It was whatever opportunities came along.
So do you know where that decision comes from? I mean, what's the inspiration that sort of guides him on that path? I'm
not entirely sure. There is evidence that the Parker family may have met William Bradford, who he ended up being apprenticed with. May have met him. He appears in other documents. There was an apprenticeship for his older brother, John, and Bradford appears as one of the people who witnessed the indenture document. So there was some kind of a connection there. They would have known each other. I think Jana realized that she needed to get her kids, the boys, apprenticed out pretty quickly, not only because by virtue of the law, this was education, but also because she was a widow, and she had to deal with that now. So he would have been packed off at 12 years old to New York to live with Bradford.
Okay, and Bradford is a well-known New York printer at this time.
Yeah, he's, like I said, before he started out in Philadelphia, he ended up in New York after getting in trouble with the Quakers, renounced Quakerism and went to New York and became a rather successful printer there. He had the first newspaper, which was the New York Gazette. And so he was a good person to get in with. He had the government printing and so on.
So how was Parker's apprenticeship with Bradford? Was it successful?
I would have to say yes. A lot of apprentices ended up running away because they were ill-treated or they were abused or perhaps even worse. There's no indication that happened. Now, Parker did run away towards the end of his apprenticeship. William Bradford put an ad in the newspaper basically advertising the last, I think, 8 months of his apprenticeship for sale, which wasn't uncommon. If you didn't have the work, because the apprentice was living with you, and you had to provide for them food and clothing and everything else, so this was a burden. So I guess maybe he didn't have enough work, so he offered this for sale. And Parker, by this point, he was about 18, 19 years old. He probably figured, I'm good enough to go out on my own. And so he took to the road. He couldn't work in New York because he was a runaway apprentice. So he ended up in Philadelphia, where he ended up with Benjamin Franklin in his shop and living with the Franklins for a time. So he learned his skill both from Bradford and from Franklin.
So how long is he with the Franklin? So when he's in Philadelphia, he's no longer an apprentice or considered an apprentice at this point?
He probably was working as a journeyman at that point. He was there about 8 years. And he just kind of disappears out of the records for the most part. But there's letters that Franklin had written where later on where he talks about Parker having lived with them. So he would have been there for a lot of events in the Franklins' lives. Okay,
so after his term in Philadelphia or his work there, when does he come back to New Jersey?
Well, he went to New York first. In 1741-42, Ben Franklin, he became... Parker and Franklin became silent partners, and Franklin bankrolled Parker to go back to New York and to establish a print shop there in opposition to Bradford. Bradford, by this point, was an old man, and his career was, on the wane. And this was a perfect opportunity. He saw skills in Parker worth backing, that he could be the heir apparent to the printing in New York, printing business in New York. So he sent him back there and helped to set him up and financed him and so forth. So he was there for about 10 years before he came back to New Jersey. It's hard to pin down an exact date, but it was the early 1750s, maybe 1752, 53 in that period.
Okay, and he sets up his print shop where?
In Woodbridge.
Okay, and so the regulations that we talked about earlier, this is the first permanent print shop in New Jersey. And so he's, I guess, abiding by those regulations at this time? Yeah,
well, he sought permission to do this. He applied to the colonial government, which Woodbridge is just north of Perth Amboy, which is where they would alternate between Burlington and Woodbridge. So it was Burlington and Perth Amboy. So it was convenient. But he applied to the government and said, look, I know you have printing jobs that you need done. It would be a lot more convenient to have me in Woodbridge printing it for you than having to go into New York or, and so forth. So that kind of got him around those regulations.
Okay. And so I guess the why for Woodbridge would be partly because of the close proximity to Perth Amboy, where there may be the jobs for him to print. And also you mentioned his family was still living in Woodbridge at that time?
Oh, yeah. Even when he was living in New York, he maintained property in Woodbridge.
Okay.
Matter of fact, and he would go back and forth. He would spend some time there, and he would go back there for his health. He suffered from ill health all of his life.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, he suffered from debilitating gout to the point where he'd be bedridden for months at a time.
Wow. Huh.
And so he would go back to Woodbridge to recover his health, back to the country. Huh. And they had a farm there. Some of his letters talk about growing turnips and that kind of thing. So we know they had a farm there. They had land there. They had livestock and so forth.
So what sort of material is he printing?
You name it, he printed it. In New York, he was printing newspapers, he was printing money, he was printing lottery tickets, he was printing the laws of the assembly. Every year they would publish this book, which would be all the resolutions that were passed and new laws and so forth. And in New Jersey, he was doing pretty much the same sorts of things, just not a newspaper at that point.
Okay. So currency was part of it.
Lottery tickets. He did dabble with a magazine, the New American, which was the first periodical printed in New Jersey as well.
Huh. So this would have been standard printing jobs that most colonial printers were.
Yeah.
All right. So are there any controversies that he gets involved with?
Oh, there were a lot of controversies, actually. I mean, the seminal one, I think, would probably be part of what drove him to come back to New Jersey. He was printing a magazine called The Independent Reflector for 3 New York lawyers, that included William Livingston, who went on to become the first governor of New Jersey under the United States. And it was very controversial because they would sort of criticize the government, very strongly, vehemently. There was, at that time, what would become Columbia University, King's College in New York, was being established. There was a huge controversy over whether or not it should be Anglican or not, should it be secular, and so forth, and really got heavily involved in that. You have to remember, too, that back then you could write an article, you could create a magazine and not put your name down. You could do it purely anonymously. So the only name that was on these things was the printers. So when the government didn't like what you were printing and they couldn't get to you, they would go after the printer and try to suppress you that way. They would threaten you and so forth. And that's pretty much what happened. They threatened Parker. He was also the secretary and comptroller for the post office in New York, or actually for all the northern colonies at the time. And that was a job that he inherited from Ben Franklin when Franklin went back to England. And this was a lucrative kind of a job. This was something that he would have gotten a lot of money from, in addition to his printing endeavors. And it gave him some kind of status in his community as well. So he didn't want to lose that. So they threatened him that if he didn't stop printing for what they were called the triumvirate, the guys that were behind this magazine, that they would take away not only the government printing, but also his job as secretary and comptroller. They would ruin him, basically, financially ruin him. So he always said that he came back to Woodbridge for his health, but it's just immediately following all this controversy in New York. And I think at that point, he just wanted to get away from it. I think it just stressed him out, and he was ready for a change.
So in New York, there's this controversial period. How about in New Jersey? Is he printing any material that is?
Not a lot that was controversial. He did. There was something called the Constitutional Current, which was printed in the form of a newspaper, but it was only one sheet, one issue, and it came out of his Woodbridge print shop, and it was vehemently against the Stamp Act. Probably one of the strongest worded things against the Stamp Act. But we don't think that he actually printed it. He may have known that it was being printed, but one of his journeymen, William Goddard, we think he printed it using using the printing equipment there at Woodbridge. But there's some evidence that Parker may have known that he was doing this, but there was deniable. He could deny it.
Okay.
Deniable.
So he has journeymen and apprentices as well in his shop.
Yeah. He had many journeymen apprentices and journeymen over the time, because he was operating the print shop in New York. He was operating the print shop in New Jersey for a period of time. He was in New Haven, Connecticut. He established their first newspaper. So he had a shop up there. Briefly, he had a shop in Burlington. Matter of fact, he went out there in part to do the same thing he had done in Woodbridge. And Woodbridge being its proximity to Perth Amboy made sense to get the government printing. Well, he could go over in Burlington, which was the capital of West Jersey, and have the same kind of a setup. It didn't work out, partly because of the problems with the Stamp Act, and also there was a law that required him as secretary and comptroller, again, that lucrative position, that required him to live in New York. So he couldn't really, it wasn't practical for him to stay out there. But he had plans to start a newspaper in Burlington, which would have been New Jersey's first newspaper if it had actually happened.
So how long does his Woodbridge print shop last?
From about 1752-53 through the end of his life in 1770.
He dies at what year?
1770.
Okay, and where is he buried?
He's buried in Woodbridge, in the Presbyterian, the graveyard behind the First Presbyterian Church. We don't know specifically where, because there was no gravestone. But from his obituary, we know that's where he ended up.
Okay, and does the shop itself continue under some different ownership after that, or?
Well, the one in Woodbridge, his son, Samuel Franklin Parker, tried keeping it going for a little while. The Franklin part comes from his association with Benjamin Franklin. But he wasn't able to make a big success of it. And then, of course, the Revolution came along, and that was pretty much it. He ended up going into the militia, and that was basically the end of it.
Okay. And is there any indication today? I know for your book you researched a bit about where the original print shop in Woodbridge stood. Do we know today where it was?
Well, the leading theory is that it's on the corner of, I think it's Grove Avenue and Amboy Avenue, where the St. James Catholic school is right now, the playground is.
Okay.
We know that the family owned the property. It encompasses property that I believe was left to him by his father, left to Parker by his father. But it went from roughly where Main Street is now all the way back to the Turnpike, and from Amboy Avenue all the way to where Route 9 is.
Oh.
So it was a large swath of land. It would make sense to have it near a main road because it's a business. But he also owned other properties around Woodbridge. So it's a logical guess, but we don't have any contemporary material that says definitely this is where it was.
Has there been any attempt to do archaeology work or sort of poke around the grounds at this site?
You'd have to get the St. James, have to talk to the folks at St. James to get permission to dig up all their stuff. The problem was that the ground has been so churned over. The church itself was moved from Upper Main Street to that corner, an earlier incarnation of the church. And when they were digging the foundations, supposedly they found a quantity of type. Metal, the metal type.
And this would have been what year?
It was the 1920s, I think 1923, 24, somewhere in there. And I have not been able to track down what happened to that type or anything more that you could look at and say it's 18th century or not. Certainly there were other printers working in the area. There's also the question of what happened to the print shop itself. The legend, the local story is that it was burned down by the British in 1777. 1777. By the British, and you go back and you look at the records, the damage records, the claims after the war was over. People lost homes, they lost livestock, and so forth, and so they made these claims after the war was over for property damages. And the Parker family is in there. They talk about damage to part of a printing office. They call it an office. They didn't call it a shop. To part of a printing office, but they don't say it was burned down. The Samuel Franklin Parker's house, the son's house, that was burned to the ground. And they detail everything they lost right down to a child's tin whistle. So you figure if they're going to get that specific about what was lost, certainly if they had lost a printing press, type, things that would have been worth a lot of money, they would have mentioned it, and there is no mention of it. I don't think it was a working press at that time. And I think that the burning down of the house became mutated over time in the retelling to be the print shop itself.
And so what's Parker's legacy?
Well, he has a lot of legacies, but I think probably it's his role in the evolution of journalism. Printers started out printing newspapers as a way to make money. They could sell advertising. You paid to have your material printed in it. So it was an economic thing at first. And then as time went on and different interests realized that they could use newspapers for propaganda purposes, for getting agendas across, when the government realized you would get in trouble for it and so forth, it became this socio-political force. And it was really that struggle of trying to figure out what should the limits of this be. The concept of freedom of the press was novel back then. So what should you be allowed to print? What is the role of this thing that we know today as journalism? And I mean, not that Parker is unique in that, but printers all throughout the colonies through this period were doing this, but we're struggling with these questions. But his personal struggles with controversy and trying to avoid a jail cell and live to print another day. This is how he put food on his family's table. Those pragmatic decisions they had to make, that's where the idealism of journalism kind of came out of.
So ultimately, I mean, we talked earlier about the regulations that sort of passes after the Revolutionary War, and these concepts of freedom of the press spring from that time period after the war. Tell me a bit about all of this information you've compiled into a book, and so tell me a bit about the book.
Oh, it's called James Parker, A Printer on the Eve of Revolution, and took me about on and off around 9 years to write. A lot of research, a lot of time. It's probably the most complete documentation of Parker's life and his role. And also, I try to use his life as sort of a common thread to explore other aspects of 18th century culture, the apprenticeship system, for example, the controversy between Anglicans and Presbyterians back in the day of the independent reflector controversies and so forth, and so on. The role of slavery. He was a slave owner. He paid off a debt to Benjamin Franklin, a postal debt, by sending him a slave. So there's all these aspects that you can kind of pull off of, and because it's not only, in order to understand why Parker's significance, why he got in trouble for the things he got in trouble, you kind of have to understand the landscape that he was working within.
So putting him in a larger context.
Putting him in a larger context, yeah.
So you mentioned letters, surviving letters. I'm sort of curious of what sort of original documents you looked at to sort of pull this story together. Where did you go to find this material?
Well, there's three main caches of his letters. The first cache, the biggest cache, is the ones that he wrote to Benjamin Franklin, and they're in Philadelphia. I used mostly the transcripts that all of Franklin's papers are being put into volumes. They've been doing since the 60s. I don't think they're done yet, but all those documents were transcribed. They cover a very specific period in his life. There's another cache that he wrote to John Holt, who was a business partner of his. When Parker was living in Woodbridge, Holt was running the operations in New York, and so they would write back and forth. Later on, things went sour. He was actually suing John Holt, so there's a cache of his letters that he wrote to his lawyer, Jared Ingersoll, in New Haven, Connecticut, which is where Holt was. He was running the operations up there at the time. So those are the main body of letters, and it's wonderful because he speaks to you in his own voice in these letters. It's a very candid thing. And you can kind of flesh him out as a human being.
So you have, so certainly the letters, like you said, in his own voice. The papers, the currency, the material that he printed, does that survive as well?
Yeah, some of it does. I have one of his newspapers. You can find them out there. I have some of his money, two of his notes. You can still find those out there in auctions and sometimes even on eBay. There's a company that specializes in old newspapers that sometimes has copies of his newspapers, and even the Independent Reflector and that kind of thing. They're a little pricey, but they're out there.
So when we talk about him, we don't know what he looked like per se. I mean, there's you mentioned about the runaway ad that Bradford prints. Is that there's some indication in there of what he wore or maybe what he looked like?
That's the sole description that we have of him, and it's obviously all written. There's no pictures or drawings. We know that he was blonde. We know that he probably did not have smallpox because he was described as having a smooth complexion. Back then, that was a scourge of children growing up. So describing somebody as being pock-pitted was not uncommon. But he was stocky build. But they really described his clothing in a lot greater detail, probably because you didn't have a lot of changes of clothing. So that was an obvious marker. And what was interesting is that his clothing would have been, the clothing that were described would have been a bright yellow. We think of 18th century clothing as being very dark and very, dark colors, muted colors, and so forth. Having bright colors was a sign of success because it was a little more expensive to get dyed cloth. So that it was almost being boasting that you had extra, you had the money, you were a successful person.
And from that description, you had an artist recreate.
My mother, actually, Jacqueline Bond, she's an artist, and she created a painting of him based upon that description. Michelle Danzig, who's a costuming expert, she went through the description and translated it into something that we could make into a visual representation. So that's the only visual representation we have of him is that painting, thanks to that ad.
Great. Well, Gordon, I want to thank you for coming in and talking to us about the life of James Parker and about the early printing history of New Jersey. Thank you.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as we explored the early printing history of New Jersey and learned about James Parker. For comments or suggestions about the show, you can visit the East Brunswick Public Library website at ebpl.org. You can learn more about New Jersey history by visiting a free online history magazine at gardenstatelegacy.com, where you can also watch back episodes of On the History Trail. So thank you for watching, and come along again as we travel on the History Trail.